All right, let's talk with Nick in Tennessee. Nick in Tennessee, you have a question about what can atheists, skeptics, or non-believers use as a moral standard, which is an interesting conversation and that I would love to have with you. Oh, there you are. Yes, perfect.
Okay. You may remember a few weeks ago, we had a conversation about the ethics of Noah's flood, right? And what exactly would make it wrong for God to. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I was bringing up the point that from the perspective of minimizing suffering, it could be said that God essentially murdering all those people could be merciful if the rest of their lives would have been predominated by suffering, right? Mm-hmm. At which point either you or Eric said that there are other standards beyond just minimizing suffering that we use to determine what's good and moral. Mm-hmm. And we were kind of towards the end of the call at that time. You had to move on. So I just wanted to kind of revisit that and say, like, all right, well, what standards should we use as non-believers to try and figure out what behaviors are moral, ethical, acceptable, preferable? Like, how do we figure that out now that we don't have holy books and stuff to just give us all the answers?
That is a very big question, Nick.
Yes.
I think there is. I mean, I have some feelings about this one. The one that I would actually point you back to a conversation I think that happened last week with Ale, I think, where we talked about the conflict between harm reduction, which I think is kind of what we were talking about, that concept of minimizing suffering, and autonomy and consent, and how those can clash sometimes, because those are fundamentally two different ways of weighing whether something is moral. And there are areas where there are questions about, which do you prioritize? Because, like adhering to one would necessarily result in a loss of the other. So, harm reduction is one. Consent and autonomy is the one that I tend to gravitate the most to, with that harm reduction kind of a close second. And that's just the concept that, like, anything that violates the sacredness, the autonomy and consent of someone else is immoral. If they would not agree to it and it happened to them anyway, and it could have been avoided, that is a problem. And we should work together to, resolve that and make sure that doesn't happen as much moving forward. And this could be anything from an individual being forced to do something they didn't want to do, that could hurt them either physically or mentally. This could be something as broad as, say, the ecological effects of climate change and how that is impacting certain lower income communities more. And so what are we doing that is violating the ability for those groups of people to consent to their water drying up, or, having rain, like all of these things. So that is another thing to think about. I think for me, the biggest kind of mind-blown moment when I was deconverting was the idea that there was no one answer and that I could cherry pick. And people are going to take that out of context. I will come for you if I see this clip. But essentially what that looks like is there is not one right answer. There just isn't. If somebody says they have the one right answer, I would actually be very skeptical of that person, because most philosophical concepts by themselves in isolation make sense until you put them in the real world and follow them through to their logical conclusions. And it's hardly ever helpful. We can talk about skepticism all day, but if we were to follow skepticism to its logical conclusion in the real world as just a strict moral philosophy, we wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. It would lead right into hard solipsism. If we were to, talk about practicality and what does it mean to be pragmatic? If we move into pragmatics all the way and just commit to that 100%, that way lies madness. So it really does become a situation where you are responsible for owning what you consider to be your morality and backing that up however you see fit. Which on the one hand is, again, a lot of work, because you don't get to just look at this one book or this one philosophy or this one person who seems to have it all figured out, be like, yes, that one, please and thank you. Don't need to think about it again. Just run every situation down this checklist. If it meets those requirements, we're good. It becomes a lot more gray. It becomes a lot more fluid. And that can be very uncomfortable. But I, as an individual, could not tell you, Nick, what the nuance of your morality should be, apart from what I think mine is. And clearly I have convinced myself that mine are the best, which are, consent and autonomy and harm reduction. So, I mean, that was kind of a long answer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. No, that's overall, yeah, I get you that we kind of each have to find the standards that make the most sense to us. I guess my question too, more generally would be, so what kind of, I guess you said that the ones that you chose are the ones that feel the most right to you. So I guess I understand. Because like when I've had conversations with theists, and I try like critiquing God's moral system, right? Where God's like, it's okay for me to kill these people because I decided that they were bad. And I'm telling them like that's not good, and then they're saying, well, that's God's rule system and they've got their ethical system. So they like to say like, well, you've got your ethics and I've got mine. What's wrong with that? And so it feels very, I don't know, it's very frustrating to end that everybody has to find the moral system that fits them best, because like there are people who believe some really terrible things about others for what they perceive to be moral reasons.
Yeah.
And then I have a question about specifically like consent and autonomy when dealing with, say, prisoners or people that have wronged others in some way and need to be punished, but they're not going to agree and want to be punished. So any punishment that's inflicted on them is inherently a violation of their autonomy and consent. But we realize that for the good of our society, that kind of has to happen.
Right.
So in that framework, how then do you justify and decide how to evaluate punishment?
Well, yeah, I mean, both of those questions are huge. So let me break this down into the two parts that you kind of presented them. So the first part about theists saying, well, you have your ethics and I have mine. For the average, like, sans religious extremism actually hurting other people, cool. If we were in a world where the extremist Christian could go to their little church and there were, protections in place so that they couldn't hurt anybody, then, they get to live in their little bubble. And yeah, we can't force them to change how they are going to see the world. What we have to do is make sure that that viewpoint doesn't then infringe on other viewpoints. And it's very dishonest for two reasons. For especially, American Christians to use that argument against you. You have your ethics, I have mine. On the one hand, theologically, they don't believe that, right? So that is their way of saying I give up. Because if they truly believed that their morality was just their version of it and yours was just as valid, they would cease to be the type of religious person that they are a lot of the time. Not always, but the argument that Christianity makes is that they are correct and other people are not. and they have access to a higher law or a higher truth, and you do not, or you are actively rejecting it. And so to say, well, I have my worldview and you have yours, to me, that always feels like they want to end the conversation as quickly as possible in a way that will get them out of it because they're uncomfortable. Because that's not really their worldview a lot of the time. So it's dishonest for that reason. It's also dishonest because it's one thing to say, I have my ethics, you have yours, when you are both on equal footing in a society. And ideally, that's where we would be. We would be in a situation where this person could believe that harm reduction was most important. This person could believe that autonomy was most important, and we could find a way to live together. But that's not where we are right now. We are in a situation where the theistic, especially the Christian nationalist worldview, is attempting to dominate other worldviews and enforce their morality and ethics onto others. So to say, well, you have yours and I have mine, erases the reality of what is actively happening based on their actions. So again, this isn't every person who you may have this conversation with, but in general, when someone says that and they are backing away from you, they are backtracking, they are telling you they don't want to talk about it anymore. And hey, you know what? If that's as far as you're going to get with that conversation, then that's as far as you're going to get. You could then have a conversation about, okay, you have yours, I have mine. What do we do now? How do we figure this out? And then they get to talk about how, well, yours is wrong for these reasons and mine is right for these reasons. And then you can get into the nitty gritty. But for the most part, it really does become a conversation of, okay, then how do we decide who gets to make the call? As opposed to, well, this is the basis of mine and this is the basis of yours. And a lot of the times that can actually be more helpful in figuring out where the other person is coming from. So for first part, how's that feel?
It feels good. Yeah. That the response that your description that they would kind of be trying to wrap up the conversation or move away from it kind of I guess summarizes the reactions I've seen fairly well. So I'll give that some thought. We can go on to the other half.
Absolutely. So the second half is actually a much bigger conversation because the idea of imprisonment and the prison system, again, specifically in the US, I cannot speak for outside of it, is a huge and complicated problem for a couple of reasons. One, currently it is deeply corrupt. And let's set that aside because we're just going to get into, the prison industrial complex, and we don't need to do that today. So assuming that only people who were really a harm to other people were imprisoned, and assuming also that they had free will, which is a whole other problem. Then, okay, we'll go with this scenario. Everyone has free will, and only people who are actually a harm to other people are in prison.
And if I might add that the person doesn't do anything like outright evil, like torture or starve or mistreat the people other than just like secluding them. Okay.
Yeah. In that case, the conversation would become a utilitarian one, at least if I was the one having the conversation. So utilitarianism is essentially the most simplistic version that everybody knows is Spock, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And it's just kind of this concept of, all right, if you have this situation where your morality is repelled by both options, right? On the one hand, you are taking away the autonomy of an individual. And on the other end, if you do not do that, harm will come to other people. It really does become a case-by-case basis. I don't think that this is something that has one big blanket answer, apart from, will reducing the autonomy of person A result in more people being able to exert their own? Because if person A is harming somebody, the assumption is that they are doing so without the other people's consent. And if the goal is to maintain the most people maintaining consent, then you would need to then remove the thing that was taking that consent away, even if that was another person. So at that point, it becomes a numbers game, and that's a really weird, cold way to look at it. And every case obviously would be different, but it would truly become, okay, if consent and autonomy is my goal, taking harm reduction off the table for a second, if somebody is harming other people, they are violating autonomy and consent of those people. And one person's autonomy and consent weighs the scale less than potentially 5, 10, 20 people's autonomy and consent. And so that would be how then I think a lot of people would make that call.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. And it's all just, it's uncomfortable to talk about too, because it then becomes, I'm taking these people's autonomy and playing this game with math with them. But it really is the only way that I've found that can allow for some kind of moral structure outside of just blindly obeying, well, everyone who does this gets this amount of time in prison, and, you know, regardless of any other circumstances, everybody is going to have to deal with this. Like, it ends up being a situation where too many people are taken advantage of and too much harm is done, proportionate to what would have been done if nothing had happened. And now I'm rambling. Nick, thoughts?
No, that's good. I'm following along fairly well. See, I'm trying to think what, playing the devil's advocate a bit, how the theist would respond. I guess the roadblock that I would run into is what makes autonomy a good moral standard to use? Like, why that instead of utilitarianism? Because autonomy allows people to risk harm and to do things that we know to be unwise, like smoke or drink or whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
And by allowing them to express themselves how they feel, we are allowing them to hurt themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that when we are responsible for somebody else's health, i.e., if we are the guardian of a child, and we see that child about to consume something toxic, that we have to intervene and inhibit their autonomy for their own safety and well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the theist would say that autonomy is not an acceptable, highest moral standard, because it's more important that people be healthy or kept safe or whatever other metric or standard, something that they would base in their theistic dogma, right? And they're God says this, so that's arbitrarily, objectively the right thing. So if somebody were to ask, how would you justify making or using autonomy and quote unquote free will as your standard for morality, how do you back that up in instances where that includes allowing people to commit self-harm or do other reckless, dangerous behaviors, etc.?
Right. And I think that there are, again, a couple of parts. I do want to make sure that we are keeping harm reduction on the table. I think that there are people who probably just have autonomy as their, like we were talking about ANCAPs earlier. There are people who just have autonomy as their moral structure without the harm reduction piece, and that can be harmful, absolutely. We need that harm reduction component in order to do exactly as you said. Oh, that person is in danger of hurting themselves without knowing it. I'm going to intervene and reduce the amount of harm that is about to happen. So again, gray area, but you absolutely need that harm reduction piece. That said, a lot of my and a lot of people's reason for gravitating to autonomy as a moral structure or a value is that, and Christians will understand this. Like the theists that you're talking to will get it. If you say, okay, let's say we take autonomy off the table. Goodbye First Amendment, goodbye Second Amendment, goodbye all freedom to do what you think is best for yourself. Someone else is going to decide that for you. Would you be comfortable with an atheist government deciding what is healthy and right for you? And obviously, if they are anything like the Christians in my life, that would be an absolute no. No, of course not.
Right.
Okay, so either the only way that we get out of the autonomy as being a necessary moral value is actually establishing a universal moral truth. Once we have that, maybe we don't need autonomy as much anymore. But it's a stopgap measure because otherwise we are constantly going to be told by competing ideologies what is healthy and right to do. And that's unsustainable. So at that point, that Christian that you're talking to is going to have to do one of two things. They're either going to have to acknowledge that autonomy is necessary for them to practice their faith just as much as it is anything else, or they're going to have to double down on, but mine is correct, which invalidates what they said previously, which is, well, you just have your ethical worldview and I have mine, right? You can't have both. If they want to get out of that conversation without having to prove absolutely that their moral structure is correct, they need to accept that autonomy is a necessary moral value, because otherwise they're going to get themselves into hypothetical situations where their church is being told by an atheist government that it's not healthy to congregate on Sundays anymore, right? So we need that autonomy piece, not because by itself it is some ideological goldmine, but because otherwise we leave ourselves open to other people telling us what is moral, other people telling us what to do with our bodies in ways that we cannot trust and ways that conflict with each other. So practically, it's kind of a necessary component unless you're advocating for some kind of theocracy.
Okay. So when, I guess a contingent I would hear is when we advocate for autonomy and like informed consent and better education for people, like for kids, for example, so they can make good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get upset because we are trying to teach kind of an acceptance of things that they view as immoral,
mm-hmm.
and they get upset because they feel they have a right to teach their kid their morals how they feel like it. Is that a violation of the parents' consent or the parents'
autonomy?
Yeah, autonomy to teach their kids the system that they believe is correct.
Well,
We wouldn't want a Christian religion teaching kids creationism only in schools.
Right.
So,
And the problem with that line of questioning very quickly becomes apparent when you ask, well, what about the child's autonomy? And the unfortunate fact of the matter is that a lot of religious people do not see children as full humans. Dennis Prager, what did a fifth grader ever do to make the world a better place? Right? So they don't see children as also having consent and autonomy. And so it becomes... Sorry, what now?
Wasn't the Virgin Mary about the age of a fifth grader?
Oh, shit. It's very possible.
Anyway, sorry, continue.
So, no, exactly. So like the concept of, well, what do I get to do with my children breaks down if you really are adopting an autonomy-based worldview, because you need to either admit at that point children aren't humans with autonomy and the ability to consent, or, children are. In that case, the goal is to protect the autonomy of the child. And if the child is not consenting to being indoctrinated or being told misinformation, then that is a violation of those children's consent. So it does then become a conversation about, do you see children as people? And unfortunately, in this country, children don't have rights. And a lot of abuse happens because of that worldview, that children are not full people and they don't get consent and autonomy until they're adults. So yeah, at that point, it becomes a whole different conversation around, well, are children capable of autonomy and consent to you? Because that should be the conversation. What are the kids consenting to? And what are they capable of consenting to? As opposed to, what do I get to do with my property? Because property is a completely different conversation to have, right? If they were like, what do I do with my car or the trees in my yard? Like, those then become, oh, well, is it actively hurting someone? No? Cool. Do what you want, right? But yeah.
There's an argument that the kid doesn't know that what they're being taught might be harmful, in the same way that a child may not know that what they're about to consume is toxic. And the parent, as the guardian of the child, is responsible for making decisions about what things are, safe or unsafe for the kid. And so I think they would view it as like other people imposing harmful beliefs and whatnot on their children.
And at that point, then they get right back into, well, how do you know it's harmful? Because my view is correct. How do you know? If they are going to make the positive claim that teaching children sex education or using pronouns in front of children or, whatever they are freaking out about is actively harmful, they're going to have to come with evidence. And that's where the skepticism piece comes in, because it's not enough for them to just say, I think it's harmful, therefore I'm going to violate someone else's right. If someone is walking out into the street and there's a bus coming, everybody knows what is going to happen if they don't get out of the way. You can pull them out of the way, and there's a very good reason for that. If you say X belief system or this information that is vital to growing up as a healthy person is going to hurt my child, you're going to have to explain objectively why that hurt, what that hurt is, and what's going to happen. Or you're going to have to, again, say, my worldview is correct, I'm advocating for a theocracy. So yes, if they want to make the claim that X thing is harmful for a kid, where are the stats? How do we determine that? What are the stories that those kids have told upon growing up? All of these kinds of conversations can be had. We don't need to shut them down, but we need to make sure that what we're doing at that point, once harm is brought into the equation, is that harm is being actively proven and that we can tell that that is borne out and then make a decision. If they're saying, well, it's harmful because I don't agree with it, that's just saying I'm right, you're wrong. And then they need to prove that they're right.
Okay, yeah, fair.
Yeah. It's windy. So, it is windy, man. Like, it's not, there's no one silver bullet, but having all of these in your back pocket, I think, will definitely help.
Yeah, for sure. And I get it if you need to go to another caller. But I was curious about circling back around to the, I guess their conclusion that, or when they say, well, you have your beliefs and I have mine. I think when I have heard that used, it's kind of in, I want to say almost a Pascal's wager kind of context, where it's like, well, if your moral system is correct, then everybody just gets to choose what they feel like. And I feel like going with the Bible. What's wrong with that? Whereas if talking from their perspective, whereas if my ethics are correct, then following God is right. So I should do that. So in either instance, following God makes the most sense. Does that make sense?
That does. And I've definitely encountered that as well. And again, that's why that harm reduction piece has to come into play, right? You can talk about consent and autonomy, and I encourage people to do so, but you have to pair it with that harm reduction piece, because that is what is going to actually, engage that part of the conversation. Well, if you are believing that, autonomy is so important, it's my autonomous choice to decide that I get to run my car into the flea market, right? Like that, okay. But also now we bring in that harm reduction piece. You get to do whatever you want to do as long as it's not harming other people. And if we can see that it is, and again, we're going to have to come up with the proof that it is harmful, and we can do that in the case of, religious overreach, then that is objectively wrong as you can get. So if they are granting autonomy and they are granting harm reduction, you guys have a lot of common ground that you can play on. Whether or not you think those two values come from a God or not is a separate conversation. But if you can get them to agree that consent and autonomy is valuable, because otherwise, they would be told what to do by atheists or whatever, hypothetical you want to scare them with. And that harm reduction is a positive, because otherwise, why would you care if we were teaching your kids things you thought were harmful? Clearly, you do value harm reduction. All right, now we both agree that autonomy and harm reduction are values we should be looking at. What else is needed to make decisions? Or can we start making decisions that honor both of our worldviews using these values? And as long as they're willing to grant those things and then bring evidence to the table when they claim that something is harmful, honestly, a lot of the problem goes away.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. This was a lot of fun. I feel like my brain just went to the gym. I hope yours does as well. We do need to move on to the next caller, but Nick, I know that you're having some interesting conversations on your end of things. Feel free to call back and let us know how things go. If you have other questions about how to engage with theists, or if anybody out there does, this is my kind of conversation. I love this. Good luck.
Yeah, thanks.
Of course.
Have a good day.
Bye.